Here is Robert Oster Tolerance, a purple ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. Here we have a darker purple, but not a dark purple. Certainly a nice middle, not close to magenta or blue, and the chromatography will really show that. There is some slight tone variation as you change pen and paper, though it is very predictable in how it does it. Generally, it does shade well and on most papers. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it maintains a nice purple tone, no weird color shift, and shades some as well as staying very well behaved. This is the first Orlando Pen Show exclusive, and it is a good ink. I hope they make it kind of regularly available in some way. It's very good, and we need more like this. The pen for today is a gift from a viewer, a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. A nice darker purple with no feathering, no spread. It does shade, thank you for that. When you look at thank you on the second line, the T is lighter than the H that gets quite dark. The AN lighten up a little bit, and that K at the end becomes very dark again. Now U at the beginning of the Y, it's a little bit lighter. During the downstroke it darkens, but then lightens its way out. The O is very dark in the middle, and the U does lighten in tone. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer.
Here is Robert Oster Fire Engine Red. Here is Robert Oster Forest Green. Here is Robert Oster Gold Antiqua. Here is Robert Oster Graphite.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. This is a slight bit lighter in tone than we had on the Clairfontaine, a little bit flatter as well. Now it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does have a light peppering of shading that goes throughout it. It's not too bad. When you take a look at words like have in the middle of the second line, it's very dark throughout that. Gone next to that starts lighter on the GON and gets a bit darker with the E at the end. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue notes back here. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. This is a slightly darker, and it's not, something about it just feels off as a tone of purple, just really as a result of the paper, showing that this is a slightly translucent ink being affected by the papers that it goes on. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does shade pretty well when you look at quickly on the second line, where the Q is a bit darker than the UIC, but the KLY at the end do become darker again. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we see that it does get a little deep into the paper on the one side, but not on the other. Could be the paper more than the ink here. I don't think any of this would stop you from writing back here. Nothing bled through to touch the page underneath. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. We see that this stands out against the quad rule without any kind of problems. Not that it was really expected to have any kind of problems, considering this is not a light ink. Now, the tone that we get is the same as the Clairfontaine, that doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. If you take a look at saluted on the second line, the downstroke of the S at the end does get a bit darker. So it starts lighter, works its way darker through the S. The A gets fairly dark. The L lightened just a tad, keeping that through the U, but the TED at the end, quite a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, there's no bleeding, no ghosting, and we can easily continue writing back here. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Robert Oster Charcoal. Here is Robert Oster Hippo Purple. Here is Robert Oster Purple Rock. Here is Robert Oster Purple Soul, formerly Purple Jazz.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. This continues to stand out very well against the quad rule. Now, the tone that we're getting is a bit lighter and flatter than we had on the Clairfontaine. Not a surprise considering the paper and that it's fairly normal here. No feather, no spread. It does shade very well, settling in on sitting on the second line, where the SI are lighter than the TT and the ing at the end does become a bit lighter. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, there's no bleeding and no ghosting. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Robert Oster Green Olive. Here is Diamine Silver Fox.
Here is Mont Blanc Ladies Edition Pearl.
Here is Robert Oster Honeybee.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. In tone, this is a little darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. It feathers quite a bit. It spreads quite a bit. Now, the feathering and the spreading I do find a bit distracting, and I don't think that this is a good ink for on this paper because it just does not come across looking good. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, we see how deep this ink does get into the paper, which explains why it feathers so much, but it did not bleed through touching the page underneath. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The Retro 51 P51 is a drier than average fine nib that, while there is some tone variation by pen, if not side by side, you may not even really notice it. Off camera, I used a wet broad to jump to the other end of the spectrum. There it shades less and was quite a bit darker and frankly less enjoyable. So I like the tone best from the run-of-the-mill medium flow broad nib to get the very enjoyable tone of purple and a generous amount of shading. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.